Already, people told me time and time and time again that I was a nightmare, and I was a nightmare, and I had a huge problem.
Few rivalries in rock history carry the weight of mystery quite like that between Elton John and David Bowie. Two of Britain's brightest stars, they emerged in the same era, wore the same glittering glam rock armor, and captivated millions with performances that felt otherworldly. But behind the sequins and stardom lay a tension that simmered for decades. For years, Elton stayed silent, letting speculation cloud the truth. Now, at 78, he finally opens up. What did he reveal about David Bowie that shocks even the most devoted fans? The late 1960s and early 1970s were a crucible of change in the music world. Rock had splintered into 1,000 directions: psychedelic, progressive, folk, heavy. And in Britain, two names would soon tower above the rest: Elton John and David Bowie. Both were born in post-war England, raised in households where rationing and austerity had left deep cultural scars. Music became not just entertainment, but escape. Elton John, born Reginald Dwight, was a piano prodigy who could mimic melodies by ear at an age when most children struggled with scales. He attended the Royal Academy of Music, but dropped out, hungry to chase fame. His rise was fueled by his songwriting partnership with Bernie Taupin, whose lyrics gave Elton's melodies depth and grit. By 1970, Elton had stormed the charts with hits like Your Song, and soon after, he was selling out arenas worldwide. David Bowie, born David Jones, was no less ambitious. He reinvented himself relentlessly, dabbling in folk, mod, and psychedelic rock before finally hitting his stride as Ziggy Stardust, the alien rock star who redefined gender, identity, and performance. Bowie wasn't just a musician, he was theater incarnate. His shows weren't concerts, they were experiences that left audiences questioning reality itself. At first, the two men seemed destined to rule the same kingdom side by side. Both glittered under the same glam rock spotlight, both captivated audiences with flamboyance and artistry, and both came to symbolize Britain's dominance of global rock in the 1970s. But the very traits that made them unique, ego, ambition, hunger for innovation, also sowed the seeds of rivalry. Behind the scenes, industry insiders whispered about a tension between them. Elton admired Bowie's fearlessness, but also bristled at his sharp tongue. Bowie, for his part, saw Elton as supremely talented, but perhaps too safe, too mainstream, too eager to please. Their paths would cross again and again, but never as friends. Instead, the world watched two icons orbit the same stage of history, destined to collide. Their first real meeting wasn't in the glare of stage lights, but in the dim corridors of the British music scene. The late 60s were a time when London's clubs teemed with hungry musicians, all vying for attention. Elton and Bowie moved in overlapping circles, sharing mutual acquaintances, producers, and even backing musicians. When they finally met, accounts vary. Some say it was cordial, two rising stars acknowledging each other's presence. Others recall sparks of condescension, particularly from Bowie, who could be cutting in private. Elton, then still insecure about his place in the industry, was sensitive to slights, real or imagined. Bowie's aura, aloof, mysterious, otherworldly, clashed with Elton's affable, down-to-earth personality. But it wasn't just personality. The two were chasing the same prize: dominance of the British charts. In 1972, Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars made him a superstar. Elton responded with Honky Chateau and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, records that not only matched Bowie's success, but, in some cases, surpassed it commercially. Suddenly, Britain had two flamboyant kings of glam, and the press wasted no time in stoking the fire. Reporters drew comparisons relentlessly. Was Bowie the true innovator, pushing art and culture into new dimensions? Or was Elton the authentic voice, blending virtuosity with pop accessibility? The narrative of rivalry became irresistible. Elton, who craved approval, found himself scrutinized through Bowie's shadow. Bowie, who thrived on provocation, made little effort to soften his words. One infamous moment crystallized their dynamic. In a private conversation, Bowie allegedly dismissed Elton as rock and roll's Liberace, a jab that cut deep. To Bowie, it was a quip. To Elton, it was a wound. For years, Elton carried that remark like a scar, one that shaped how he viewed Bowie not just as a rival, but as someone who had underestimated his artistry. Still, despite the tension, there was admiration. Elton could not deny Bowie's genius, his ability to reinvent himself with each album. And Bowie, though critical, acknowledged Elton's unmatched ability to dominate charts and stadiums. Their relationship was never simple. It oscillated between respect and resentment, admiration and rivalry. And as the 1970s unfolded, that complexity only deepened. By the mid-1970s, Elton John and David Bowie were not just stars, they were cultural forces. Elton had become one of the most successful recording artists in history, with Goodbye Yellow Brick Road cementing his place as pop royalty. Bowie, meanwhile, had moved beyond Ziggy Stardust into new personas. Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke, each more daring than the last. Both men were redefining what it meant to be a rock star, and both were in constant competition for the cultural crown. But fame magnified their differences. Elton's flamboyance was joyful, camp, drenched in sequins and feathers. He wore his heart on his sleeve, playing piano with a grin, engaging his audiences with warmth. Bowie's glamour, by contrast, was icy, alien, calculated to unsettle. Where Elton invited audiences in, Bowie kept them at a distance, daring them to chase him through his endless transformations. The media thrived on the contrast, fueling speculation of a rivalry that was as much personal as professional. They pitted the two against each other in headlines: Elton the populist versus Bowie the avant-garde. Fans debated endlessly. Was Elton selling out arenas while Bowie was pushing boundaries? Or was Bowie a pretentious provocateur while Elton was the true genius? Behind the headlines, the relationship grew colder. Elton, stung by Bowie's earlier jibes, withdrew. He avoided direct confrontation, preferring to bury his resentment under work and excess. Bowie, battling his own demons, cocaine addiction, paranoia, the pressures of fame, had little patience for mending bridges. In interviews, he could be dismissive, calling Elton's work safe or middle of the road. Elton, in turn, bristled but rarely fired back, choosing silence over escalation. Yet even in silence, the rivalry endured. Each new release from Bowie spurred Elton to reach higher. Each stadium Elton sold out reminded Bowie of the power of accessibility. They were mirror images, two men bound by fame, divided by ego. The glamour that dazzled their fans was, in truth, a veil hiding wounds neither man cared to expose. And so, through the 1970s, Elton John and David Bowie danced a strange dance. Rivals without open war, contemporaries bound by time, two legends circling each other like planets caught in the same gravitational pull. What they never said to each other would linger for decades, until at last, one man, older, wiser, chose to break the silence. By the mid-1970s, the world of rock music had fractured into tribes, each with its idols. Yet within this cacophony, two figures stood like towering monuments. Elton John, with his glitter-studded spectacles and piano-driven anthems, and David Bowie, the shapeshifter who seemed to reinvent himself with every sunrise. Their paths didn't merely cross, They collided, leaving sparks that illuminated the music world while casting shadows over their relationship. For Elton, the decade was a blur of relentless success. His albums, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Caribou, Captain Fantastic, and The Brown Dirt Cowboy, weren't just hits. They were cultural events. Every release climbed the charts. Every concert became a spectacle. He embodied joy, excess, and unfiltered flamboyance, arriving on stage in feather boas, sequined jumpsuits, or baseball uniforms, as though daring the world to accuse him of being too much. Bowie, meanwhile, was immersed in the dangerous alchemy of reinvention. Ziggy Stardust had made him a godlike figure, but he refused to be trapped. With Diamond Dogs, Young Americans, and Station to Station, he shed skins with alarming frequency, each new persona more daring than the last. His thin white Duke phase, fueled by cocaine and paranoia, stood in stark contrast to Elton's exuberance. Bowie wasn't about joy, he was about disruption. Inevitably, fans and critics demanded comparisons. Who was the true genius? Elton, the melodic craftsman capable of writing songs that millions could sing along to? Or Bowie, the provocateur who pushed rock into uncharted territory, blending theater, fashion, and social commentary into his work? The more the press leaned into the two kings of glam narrative, the more strained things became between the men themselves. One infamous moment captured the tension perfectly. At a gathering of London's music elite, Bowie allegedly referred to Elton as the token queen of rock, a phrase dripping with both disdain and homophobia. Whether Bowie meant it as a joke, a jab, or simply a cruel attempt to assert superiority, the remark devastated Elton. He was already struggling privately with his sexuality, with the pressures of fame, and with his own sense of self. Hearing it from Bowie, whom he admired despite their differences, cut deeper than any critic's pen. Elton never forgot. In his mind, Bowie's words symbolized not just rivalry, but betrayal. While the public saw glittering costumes and shared stages at benefit concerts, behind the scenes, Elton carried wounds Bowie would never acknowledge. Yet here lay the paradox: their rivalry, their bitterness, their unspoken barbs. These were also the forces that drove them. Elton admitted years later that Bowie's constant evolution terrified and inspired him. Every time Bowie broke new ground, Elton felt the pressure to raise his own game, to prove that his music wasn't just chart fodder, but art in its own right. And Bowie, despite dismissing Elton's popularity, was acutely aware that Elton had mastered something he could not: universal, radio-dominating appeal. Thus, the 1970s became less a story of friendship than of mutual obsession. They did not embrace each other as allies. Instead, they orbited each other like rival stars, their gravity pulling the rock world into new shapes. Stardust and superstition. Elton's flamboyant superstardom and Bowie's eerie alien theater defined the decade. And though they rarely spoke, each man haunted the other's shadow, knowing their names would forever be entwined. By the dawn of the 1980s, the glitter of glam had dulled. Punk had risen, disco had peaked and fallen, and the MTV era was rewriting the rules of fame. Elton John and David Bowie, once flamboyant kings of the same castle, were now aging veterans in a battlefield crowded with new contenders. But while their music continued to thrive, their personal relationship, or lack thereof, remained frozen in silence. Elton had survived the excess of the 70s, though not unscathed. Drugs, alcohol, and self-destructive habits nearly consumed him. Beneath the sequins and smiles was a man spiraling out of control, desperately trying to hold on to both his music and his sanity. Bowie, meanwhile, was enduring his own battles. His cocaine addiction had reached a terrifying peak, leaving him frail and paranoid during his thin white Duke years. Both men were at war with themselves, and neither had the strength or will to mend the rift between them. When they crossed paths, the encounters were awkward at best. Insiders recall moments where they would exchange polite words, shake hands for the cameras, and then retreat into their own camps, avoiding any deeper connection. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the things they never said, the insults left unaddressed, the admiration never spoken, the rivalry never resolved. The press continued to speculate. Stories circulated of Bowie calling Elton's music shallow, of Elton privately mocking Bowie's eccentricities. Whether these tales were truth or myth hardly mattered. What mattered was the perception that the two titans could never share the same throne. Fans longed for a collaboration that never came, a joint performance that might have healed the divide. But the silence persisted, as though both men had agreed, tacitly, that to engage was to risk reopening wounds neither wanted to face. In truth, there was fear on both sides. Elton feared that Bowie's dismissiveness was genuine, that his artistry would never measure up to Bowie's avant-garde genius. Bowie feared, perhaps, that Elton's universal popularity represented a success he himself could never attain. It was easier, then, to avoid confrontation, to let silence stand in place of reconciliation. Behind the curtain of fame, both men were lonely. Elton poured his heart into ballads like "Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word," lyrics that hinted at wounds deeper than love affairs. Bowie retreated into reinvention, donning new personas like armor against the pain of his real life. Their silence was not indifference, it was avoidance. And it would last for decades until only one voice remained to tell the story. By the 1990s, the cultural landscape that had once belonged to Elton John and David Bowie had shifted dramatically. Grunge roared from Seattle, hip-hop exploded into the mainstream, and a new generation of stars dominated the charts. Yet Elton and Bowie remained towering figures, elder statesmen of rock whose names carried weight. But beneath the public admiration lay wounds that had never healed. For Elton, the wounds were personal. Bowie's infamous remark from the 1970s, calling him rock and roll's Liberace, was a scar that never faded. To Elton, it wasn't just a dig at his flamboyance, but at his very essence as an artist. He had poured his heart into building a career that balanced showmanship with songwriting craft, only to have it reduced to a joke by someone he respected. Every time the quote resurfaced in articles or interviews, Elton felt the sting anew. And yet, there was more to the wound than pride. Elton had always admired Bowie's daring. Even when he disagreed with his methods, he recognized Bowie as a pioneer. That admiration made the insult feel like betrayal. It was as though Bowie had dismissed not only Elton's music, but Elton himself. The result was a strange paradox. Elton craved Bowie's approval even as he resented him. For Bowie, the wounds took a different form. He had never been comfortable with the machinery of fame. Where Elton embraced spectacle, Bowie often saw it as a trap. His endless reinventions, Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke, were as much about survival as artistry. Each persona allowed him to escape the crushing expectations of fans and critics. And yet, no matter how radical his art, Elton John always seemed to dominate the charts more completely. It was a bitter irony. Bowie was hailed as the innovator, but Elton was the one selling out stadiums. This quiet envy may have fueled some of Bowie's sharp words. He often deflected with humor, but his jibes carried the weight of insecurity. He could outthink, outdress, and out-experiment nearly everyone, but he couldn't outshine Elton in sheer popularity. The rivalry was less about hatred and more about the bruises left by fame. Two men struggling under the weight of expectations, lashing out in ways that left wounds instead of scars. The 1990s brought opportunities for reconciliation. Both men had weathered their demons. Elton embraced sobriety after years of addiction, while Bowie settled into a healthier rhythm after decades of chaos. Their careers intersected again at charity events and tribute concerts. Photographs show them standing near each other, polite smiles frozen on their faces. Yet the warmth of genuine friendship was absent. The silence between them remained, filled with unsaid apologies and unacknowledged admiration. Behind closed doors, Elton admitted to friends that he wished things had been different. He longed for Bowie's respect, not rivalry. He knew they had more in common than either had ever admitted. Both were outsiders who used music as a shield. Both had battled demons, and both had shaped the sound of an era. But pride, that eternal barrier, kept them apart. Fame had given them everything, except the ability to truly connect. As the 2000s unfolded, David Bowie began to retreat from the public eye. Health issues, kept largely private, forced him to slow down. After the release of Reality in 2003, he stepped back from touring, leaving fans to wonder if he had retired. For an artist who had spent decades reinventing himself in the public gaze, the silence was deafening. Elton John, by contrast, remained as visible as ever. His Las Vegas residencies, global tours, and soundtrack work kept him in the spotlight. While Bowie disappeared, Elton remained a constant, reminding the world of his resilience. Yet, despite his omnipresence, Elton felt the absence of Bowie like a shadow. He had always measured himself against Bowie, even when they weren't speaking. Now, with Bowie gone from the stage, there was no one left to rival. When Bowie re-emerged in 2013 with The Next Day, it shocked the music world. The album was hailed as a triumph, proof that Bowie could vanish for a decade and still command attention. Elton praised the work publicly, though in private, he remained conflicted. He admired the artistry, but the silence between them had grown into a canyon too wide to bridge. They had become ghosts to each other, connected by history, divided by pride. Then came 2016. The news of David Bowie's death reverberated around the globe. Fans wept openly, fellow musicians paid tribute, and the world seemed a little less colorful without its chameleon. For Elton John, the loss was personal, but complicated. In public, he honored Bowie with dignity, calling him a unique and extraordinary artist. He spoke of his influence, his brilliance, his courage. But in private, Elton wrestled with regret. He knew the silence had cost them both. They had shared a stage in history, but never truly shared friendship. They had been two sides of the same coin, yet had never acknowledged it while there was still time. The music had stopped, and with it, the possibility of reconciliation. Bowie's death was not just the end of a life. It was the final note in a duet that was never sung. In the months after Bowie's death, Elton John was unusually subdued. Friends noticed his reflective mood, the way he seemed haunted by something left unresolved. For decades, Elton had lived his life loudly, wearing his heart on his sleeve in both triumph and scandal. But when it came to Bowie, his grief was strangely private. Part of the reason was the complexity of their relationship. Unlike other musicians Elton had lost, like John Lennon or Freddie Mercury, his bond with Bowie was never one of closeness. They were rivals, not confidants. And yet, that rivalry had defined Elton's career in ways few understood. Bowie had been the invisible measuring stick, the unspoken competitor who pushed Elton to greater heights. Losing him was like losing a mirror, however distorted. In interviews, Elton kept his words respectful but restrained. He praised Bowie's artistry, his daring, his fearlessness. But he stopped short of personal anecdotes, as though unwilling to expose the wounds of their complicated history. Fans noted the absence, wondering why Elton's tributes felt muted compared to others. The truth was simple. Grief is never straightforward when it is entangled with resentment, admiration, and regret. Behind closed doors, however, Elton confessed more. He admitted to feeling guilty for holding on to Bowie's insults for so long. He regretted the silence that stretched between them, the years wasted in stubborn pride. He wondered what might have happened if he had reached out, if they had spoken openly, if they had acknowledged the bond that existed beneath the rivalry. These questions haunted him, but they had no answers. Bowie was gone, and with him, the chance for closure. The silence lingered for years. Elton rarely spoke Bowie's name, except when pressed by interviewers. It was as though the memory was too painful, too raw. He carried his grief privately, a burden he couldn't share with the world. For fans, the lack of candor only deepened the mystery of their relationship. For Elton, it was penance, a way of honoring Bowie by acknowledging the wound without reopening it. And then, at 78, Elton John finally spoke. Decades of silence, rivalry, and regret gave way to an outpouring of truth. In an interview reflecting on his life and career, Elton was asked once again about David Bowie. This time, he did not retreat behind polite words. This time, he opened up. He admitted that Bowie's words had hurt him deeply, that being called rock and roll's Liberace had left a scar he carried for years. He confessed that he had allowed pride to keep them apart, that he had resented Bowie's dismissiveness instead of confronting it. But more than that, Elton revealed something few had expected: admiration. He spoke of Bowie's fearlessness, his ability to reinvent himself, his genius for turning music into theater. He admitted that Bowie had inspired him, even when he denied it, and that much of his own daring came from trying to match Bowie's courage. Elton's voice cracked as he acknowledged his regret. He wished they had reconciled, wished they had found common ground before it was too late. He spoke of the respect he had always felt, hidden beneath layers of anger and pride. And he admitted finally that Bowie had been one of the defining figures of his life, not as a friend, but as a rival who had shaped him in ways only a rival could. The confession stunned fans. For decades, the story of Elton John and David Bowie had been one of silence and speculation. Now, at 78, Elton filled in the blanks. It was not a tale of friendship, but of rivalry, admiration, and regret. It was a human story, messy and unresolved, but honest. For Elton, breaking his silence was liberation. He no longer needed to carry the burden of unspoken truths. For fans, it was closure, a chance to understand the complicated bond between two of music's greatest icons. And for the legacy of David Bowie, it was a final tribute, one delivered not in flowers or accolades, but in honesty. At 78, Elton John finally gave the world the truth about David Bowie. And in that truth, we saw not just two legends, but two men, flawed, proud, brilliant, whose rivalry shaped the soundtrack of a generation. Elton John's confession at 78 proves that even legends carry regrets. His rivalry with David Bowie was as human as it was historic, filled with pride, silence, and admiration left unspoken. What do you think? Was this honesty too late, or the final act their story needed?